hallways and classrooms in Virginia Beach. Administrators at Princess Anne Middle School say minorities have been targeted with hurtful language since Election Day.
We get to frisk you now, and we are going to build a wall in the school and put you on the other side of it. Students at Princess Anne Middle School accused of hurtful speech following President-elect Donald Trump's victory.
It's going to make people, especially minorities, feel scared.
These parents caught off guard by a 2-page letter sent Sunday from the principal after several incidents.
Right across the street from the state capitol, over there at the iconic Shish Kebab Grill, owner Obaid Kayfoy, who is of Syrian descent, says he and his family have already experienced some odd, somewhat vague harassment since the election. There are signs in support of Syrian refugees here at the restaurant. During one incident, Kayfoy says a customer said under his breath, "We're going to get you." And then there was this.
So the day after the election, some guy came by, and you could read into this, maybe you cannot, but the guy gave my brother a $20 bill as he was cashing out and said, "Keep the change, you may need it."
If it wasn't for, the temperature of America right now, I believe that man would have never reacted that way. I stood ready. I served my country. It insulted me. It's still insulting.
The incident happened just after 6 o'clock tonight as many of those passengers on the streetcar were heading home from work. It was posted to social media shortly after that. Now we're going to show you some of that video, but I should warn you, there is graphic language.
You're a little eh? You're a little welcome to Canada. He's not from around these towns. I can tell by his face.
He didn't do anything
He
wrong.
punched me in my face.
He punched.
See what you did? You grabbed on my bro. You punched me in my face. You broke my leg, bro. You stupid? You stupid? Are you stupid? Are you stupid? It's not your fault that you punched me in my face. Come get some. Come get some.
You didn't do anything wrong.
There were several passengers who did try to intervene and calm the man down. At first, he didn't want to get off the streetcar. Eventually, he did, but then continued yelling outside the streetcar until police arrived. Now, the woman who shot the video says at one point that man did reference Donald Trump.
I told him he was a racist. He said, "Yeah, so what? Go Trump."
Been a lot of shock and anger about Trump's victory in the last 24 hours. There have been protests across the United States, in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. Demonstrators chanting, "Not my president, not today." Well, Daniel Krupp is an organizer at the Socialist Alternative New York group. He joins me now on the line from New York.
I think the first and most important thing to note is people are terrified, they are disgusted that Donald Trump is the president-elect of our country. I think what's so clear is that his white nationalist agenda and his white supremacist agenda is something that so many people find disgusting. And what's also important to remember is there are many, many millions of people who did not vote for Donald Trump and many, many millions more who didn't vote at all, who are so turned off by both parties.
Well, and as you just heard, and as we're all learning, one of his new top advisors is controversial for heading a platform for racism and the far-right movement. You mentioned the rhetoric, how it's divided people. What needs to happen to bring people together, though?
It's hard to say. I mean, it will depend on the way that he conducts his administration. But then those nominations, the nomination of Steve Bannon, for example, as one of his chief strategists is something that's very controversial and sends a very strong message that he's not really going to abandon the kind of rhetoric and the kind of divisiveness that was predominant in his campaign. You know, when a nominee for a major position in the White House is almost unanimously criticized by most of the mainstream media, but then receives the praise from the Nazi Party and the Ku Klux Klan, this is the seeds for major divisiveness and major confrontation, and it doesn't really augur well.
Let me talk about this a little bit about Steve Bannon. I mean, there's been a lot of concern expressed today about some of the things that he's associated with. Breitbart, of course, the organization he runs, has got a, let's put it, how do I put this, a reputation for some slightly robust, a slightly robust approach to news, and ways in which, frankly, a lot of people find very offensive. It's been accused of racism. It's been accused, to some extent, even of anti-Semitism. Is that something that, you know, you were mayor of New York City, you had to deal with these issues of racial tension? Is the way Bannon and Breitbart approach it, is that the right way?
I haven't seen any of that in Steve in the time that I've dealt with him. I've seen a very, very smart, very bright man, very worldly man. I also think something happens to you when the election's over. And I think you've seen it happen to Donald Trump, right? Happened to me when I became mayor. The day I woke up after being elected mayor, I realized, oh my God, I got to do this now. And there's a weight that falls on your shoulders, and you start to think in a somewhat different way. And it's not that you change your positions, but you begin to realize, I've got to bring in more people. I've got to listen to more opinions. I've got to broaden my horizons. I don't think that just happens to the president. I think that happens to the chief of staff, the policy advisor, the communications director, secretary of defense, attorney general, secretary of state. There's a different, when you're out there just criticizing, it's one thing. When you actually get on the inside, there's a certain weight of responsibility for the American people that is on your shoulders. And I think Steve Bannon is the kind of guy who gets that.
He's a nightmare, and he's the chief advisor to the President of the United States now.
This is the appointment of Steve Bannon as Trump's chief strategist continues to draw sharp rebuke. Critics citing his close ties to the alt-right movement known for white nationalism and anti-Semitism.
I work very closely with Steve Bannon. He's been the general of this campaign, and frankly, people should look at the full resume. I'm personally offended that you think I would manage a campaign where that would be one of the going philosophies. It was not.
And new concerns over conflict of interest are emerging, with Trump considering seeking top security clearance for his adult children and son-in-law, according to a transition team source.
We'll be in New York and we'll take care of the business.
No paperwork has been filed, but the children could have access to secure communications technology, travel schedules, and Secret Service procedures.
It's a very historic day, but it's also a very sad day for the United States and for Americans, because somebody who had said and who has behaved with women the way he has, somebody who has talked about Muslims and immigrants from Mexico and Mexicans, someone who has talked about climate change as a hoax, when world leaders, all companies of the world, local governments, every citizens from around the world have finally got around to saying we need to fight against climate change. This is one of the biggest threats to humanity. Someone who has said all of these things should not be supported by the American people, because the American people deserve better and the world deserves better.
Here in Berlin, it's a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. You know, Trump used Merkel as a kind of international equivalent of Hillary Clinton, a pragmatic, technocratic, inclusive politician that looked to bring people together. He criticized her refugee policy quite heavily during the campaign, said that Germany was becoming overrun, was a disaster, and on the verge of revolution. So I can imagine there's going to be a great deal of unease here in Berlin.
Bonjour, good morning. Begin my day.
Of President-elect Trump in the United States, he has said that
I believe that he understands that there are market forces already at work on this issue, and that we need to harness these forces for good of the planet and all the species in this planet. And I've been saying that as I said earlier, once seemed to be unthinkable, has now become unstoppable.
So the total is $8,737,540,000.
The size of Trump's fortune, and one which is already giving the president-elect problems. His empire includes office buildings, luxury hotels, and golf courses around the world, providing Trump with a conflict of interest minefield. Deutsche Bank holds more than $300 million of the incoming president's debt. The bank is facing calls from the U.S. Justice Department to pay up $14 billion to settle claims over its mismanagement of subprime mortgages prior to the financial crash. In all, Trump's reach stretches across around 500 companies, including in countries which have complex relations with the US, including China, Russia and Saudi Arabia. His empire is also undergoing new projects in Turkey, Azerbaijan and Indonesia. The US Constitution prohibits any government official from taking payments, gifts or sharing in profits in a company with ties to a foreign government. Closer to home, Trump's hotels benefit from government subsidies, which can either be increased or decreased by the White House. His new Washington hotel is built on federal land. The president-elect's answer? To entrust the Trump Organization to his 3 children, a decision which received criticism even before they were named as part of his White House transition team. As president, Trump will have to annually disclose his financial interests. During the campaign, he became the first candidate for the White House not to release a summary of their tax returns in 40 years.
Throughout the U.S. presidential campaign, President-elect Donald Trump, and before that candidate Trump, has made it very clear that he expects to mend ties with Moscow and that we should get along. We, the United States, should get along with Russia, and has said specifically that he expects to get along with President Vladimir Putin. This seems to be a very strong priority for him. Even when he was under tremendous assault and pressure from the Hillary Clinton campaign and from the media to disavow a warm attitude toward Russia, and was in fact being accused of being a Russian agent of influence by various people, he did not back off from it. And of course, during one of the recent debates, he said that with respect to Daesh, that Russia is fighting Daesh, Iran is fighting Daesh, Assad is fighting Daesh, which just threw into consternation a lot of the foreign policy establishment here for the fact that it was, of course, absolutely true. So this seems to be a deeply held commitment and something that Mr. Trump feels very strongly about. So I expect and I very much hope that there will be a reciprocal willingness in both Moscow and Washington under the new American administration to mend some ties and frankly, as Mr. Trump says, to make a deal.
Vladimir Putin and the U.S. president-elect have held their first telephone conversation. RT's correspondent Gayana Chichikan joins me live from Washington with the latest details. Gayana, throughout the presidential race, Donald Trump, he was talking at great length about how the U.S. and Russia should join forces, perhaps to fight international terrorism. So now he's spoken with President Putin. Do you think Trump will come good on his pledge?
Well, I certainly don't know. I would love to be a fly on the wall during that phone conversation. What we have is a readout of the phone call from the Russian president's press office, and the readout says Vladimir Putin once again congratulated Donald Trump with his victory in the presidential election, expressed Russia's willingness to be a partner to the United States based on mutual respect and quote-unquote non-interference in each other's internal affairs. Both agreed that these are difficult times for U.S.-Russia relations, and both expressed willingness to work together to normalize the relations. According to the readout of the phone conversation, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin also agreed on the importance of joining forces to fight terrorism, which could lead to the U.S. and Russia forming a united front in Syria. Throughout the presidential race, the Washington establishment and much of the media blasted Donald Trump for saying that he would he would get along with the Russian president. His friendly position on Russia, very much in contrast to Hillary Clinton's, has raised, among other things, questions about the role of NATO moving forward. At a news conference this Monday, President Obama said in his final days in office he would travel to NATO allies to assure them that they have nothing to worry about. Here.
Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President-elect Donald Trump have agreed to improve their trade and economic relations. The two spoke over the phone on Monday and discussed various issues. The Kremlin said both of them agreed that their relationship was at a low ebb and its repair needed a joint effort. Putin said Moscow is willing to improve its communication links with the new U.S. administration. They also agreed the fight against international terrorism and extremism is a priority and discussed ways to deal with the conflict in Syria.
A month has passed since the Syrian army launched an attack against foreign-backed militants in the western Ghouta region near Damascus. The operation led to the siege of Fath al-Sham militants' main stronghold of Khan al-Sheikh and revived hopes for reaching a settlement agreement similar to the previous deals reached in Daraya, Al-Hame, Qudsiyya and Al-Muaddamiyya. These agreements are still under implementation. Reaching an agreement in Khan al-Sheikh will also secure key highways linking Damascus to Quneitra and Daraa and cut supply routes used by militants between Damascus countryside and Daraa and Quneitra regions.
The Russian defense minister has announced the country's air force has begun a large-scale anti-terror combat operation in the Syrian provinces of Homs and Idlib.
For the first time in the history of the military operations of the Russian Navy, an aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, has taken part. Su-33s were also launched from this carrier. Before that, we conducted serious surveillance of all the targets. That's why the main targets have been determined. They're munition warehouses, spots occupied by the militants, to be more precise, terrorists.
The U.S. President, or outgoing U.S. President Barack Obama, ordered that all that al-Nusra terrorists can now be targeted. He made that decision after the election of Trump. There's been no decisive action yet so far, though, from the U.S.-led coalition. Do you think that's likely to happen anytime soon?
I do not. I actually think the decisive action is simply to look the other way as Russia escalates its operations. Of course, the fact that there's a Russian carrier in the Mediterranean was no secret to anyone. The fact that it's parked where it is, I think, was definitely allowed by the Western coalition. I think the West is unwilling to wrap up this destabilizing war. Obama's policy has been seen as sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, just preferring covert operations. And it appears that those who argued that covert operations in Syria, such as CIA regime change, as well as the Pentagon's train and equip program, I think the voices that said that was a complete disaster and has only added to the destabilization of the region have won out.
A phone talk between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and newly elected President of the U.S. Donald Trump has marked a new era in the U.S. Russia relations and caused panic among the EU leaders. According to Trump, he will personally oversee a constructive cooperation between two rival superpowers. In course of the talk, the Republican also promised closer cooperation with the Russian leader on international issues and outlined in this way a significant thaw in relations between Moscow and Washington. According to estimations of the Daily Express, such a development of events cannot but disturb Brussels, which is more and more afraid of the new U.S. administration's driving European politics out. The EU leaders understand that reinforcement of relations between Moscow and Washington do not bode well for adherents of the anti-Russian policy. Attacks on Trump, which have increased after results of the US elections had been announced, also evidence Brussels' fears. Jean-Claude Juncker, president of the European Commission, claimed, for instance, that election of a magnate as head of the US posed a threat to global security.
And the message from NATO has been that we want dialogue with Russia. Russia is our biggest neighbor. Russia is there to stay, and especially when tensions run high, especially when we face many different security challenges, it is important to have dialogue, to have channels for political dialogue open with Russia. That is NATO's message. How we can further strengthen the cooperation. In general, I believe
the NATO Secretary General, however, added that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would not accept, quote, Moscow's violations of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Stoltenberg referred to Crimea's reunion with Russia in 2014, which happened after a Western-backed coup toppled Ukraine's pro-Moscow president Viktor Yanukovych. The issue of Ukraine has remained a sticking point between the two sides ever since. Speaking about Washington's new strategy under Trump, the NATO chief offered assurances that Washington will remain committed to the alliance.
NATO's biggest show of force since the Cold War is underway. Russia is flexing muscle back, and the media is adding fuel to the fire. Somebody has to stop the Russians.
we are deploying 4 battalions to the eastern part of our alliance. But what we do is defensive.
Meanwhile, Lithuania has actually published a booklet on how to deal with a Russian invasion. Why stop there? Let's take it a step further and teach our kids Cold War rhetoric with books like Where the Wild Things Are. In Russia, of course, or cloudy with a chance of Russian nukes. But seriously, who is looking for war here? Let's just look at the numbers. NATO's military budget is more than 10 times bigger than Russia's, with America spending $650 billion on defense. And let's not forget, NATO bases are literally surrounding Russia. So let's just close our eyes and imagine that tomorrow, Mexico and Canada become Russian allies. and Russian troops, tanks, fighter jets, bases pop up right next door to good old America. It's pretty fucking scary, huh?
U.S. President Barack Obama has insisted he will help President-elect Donald Trump make a smooth transition into the White House. He said he believed that America under Trump's leadership would remain a pillar of strength and a beacon of hope to the people around the world.
I think that's one of the most important functions I can serve at this stage during this trip, is to let them know that there is no weakening of resolve when it comes to America's commitment to maintaining a strong and robust NATO relationship, and a recognition that those alliances aren't just good for Europe, they're good for the United States, and they're vital for the world.
Well, U.S. President Barack Obama says he doubts Iran's nuclear deal would be scrapped under the presidency of Donald Trump.
And keep in mind, this is not just an international agreement between us and the Iranians. This is between the P5+1, other countries, some of our closest allies. And for us to pull out would then require us to start sanctioning those other countries in Europe or China or Russia that were still abiding by the deal, because from their perspective, Iran had done what it was supposed to do.
Iran has rejected the European Union's concern over its missile program, saying the Islamic Republic's defense capabilities are by no means negotiable. Foreign Ministry spokesman Bahram Qasemi said Iran's missile tests are conducted within the framework of the country's defense policies. Qasemi's comments came in reaction to a statement issued by EU foreign ministers on Monday. The ministers expressed concern over Iran's missile program and urged the Islamic Republic to, quote, refrain from activities which may deepen mistrust. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman hailed the EU ministers for their renewed support for the 2015 nuclear deal between Tehran and the P5+1. Qasemi called on the bloc to work toward the full implementation of the agreement.
When it was first rumored that Trump would run for president, the comedians laughed, because nothing was funnier than Donald Trump. He started his campaign by insulting Mexicans and promising to build a wall, a beautiful wall, that would keep Mexican rapists and killers out. That made him popular. Then he started insulting the other Republican candidates. They didn't have a clue what to do. The people who count political lies reported that Trump lied more than anyone else. The more he lied, the higher he rose. He insulted the handicapped. He said Muslims should be kept out of America. He insulted war heroes, prisoners of war, and even the parents of a young man who died fighting for his country. At last, he was revealed to be a sexual predator, a serial sexual predator. Women were outraged, yet he's still standing. Each was supposed to be a misstep, which would end his run, but no. So what is it? What makes him so attractive to so many Americans? Celebrity? Oh yeah. People love their celebrity to be trashy. People love rich people, and Trump promised to make everyone rich. Is it hostility to Clinton and her ilk? Republicans love to hate the Clintons. He says she belongs in jail. Is it reaction to Obama? Is it white rage, white counter-revolution? Did Trump succeed to exploit and even inflame the culture war dividing America? I would say all of the above.
In a trade war between the U.S. and China, nobody would win. Yet Donald Trump has threatened to start one. Trade sanctions against China were a cornerstone of his presidential campaign.
China is ripping us on trade. They're devaluing their currency, and they're killing our companies. We have very unfair trade with China.
Mr. Trump has threatened tariffs of 45% on all Chinese imports. Such a move would raise the price of pretty much everything on sale in Walmart, from sneakers to microwave ovens. That would hit the pocketbooks of blue-collar workers, the very people who voted for him. And there's not much evidence it would bring manufacturing jobs back to America. Their automation, rather than Chinese sweatshops, is now the biggest threat to factory workers. But Mr. Trump's hardline advisors see trade as a weapon in a broader geopolitical contest. They think that trading with China gives it the means to build an ever more powerful military machine. One of these advisors is the economist Peter Navarro, who's produced books and videos warning of a trade threat from China.
Help defend America and protect your family. Don't buy made in China.
The same advisors are urging Mr. Trump to label China a currency manipulator for suppressing the value of the yuan to boost exports, even though Beijing is burning through its foreign exchange reserves to do exactly the opposite, prop up the yuan. On Monday, Mr. Trump spoke by phone with President Xi Jinping. His office said the two men had established a clear sense of mutual respect. Chinese state media cited Mr. Xi as saying that cooperation is the sole correct choice. If Mr. Trump throws up trade barriers, China may well retaliate against U.S. companies in China like Boeing or Apple. One market research report estimates that U.S. firms have invested at least $228 billion in Chinese companies since 1990. With stakes like these, threats of a trade war would likely trigger panic in global financial markets and economic mayhem along the corridors of trade in East Asia.
Over the last 20 years, almost all of the major corporations in the United States that produce goods for export have moved enormous amounts of their production over into countries like China. In fact, China more than any other. They have invested hundreds of billions, if not more, in that country on the presumption that they would be able to produce there and ship all that back to the United States for purchase by Americans. If the president-elect were to actually go through this, he would be dealing a body blow to mostly American corporations. Let's remember that more than half of what comes here from China is produced by American companies, subsidiaries that were established at great cost in China. Whether these large companies are going to take this lying down or be happy about it, that's a long shot, and for a president who squeaked in to office with a very small margin, he hadn't lost the popular vote, making an enemy of those large corporations would be a very strange political decision.